Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, I thought it was time to return to some Ukrainian history. When the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out just here a few years ago, I covered a handful of videos to kind of give historical context when the, war was new. And with the war seemingly entering another phase here, potentially ending, or at least negotiations maybe being on the table, I thought it was important to revisit this because I know and I can see that there's a lot of Ukrainian history that is not being talked about within the context of this conflict, as well as Russian history. And a video that just came across my suggestions feed is this one. It's called The Real Ukrainian History No One Talks About. Now, this is from a channel I have not covered before, but I've seen it. It's Artur Rehi. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that. And from what I remember, a lot of other like reactor commentary channels will come up in my feed, or I'll see it as videos that you guys are watching that also watch my stuff. So I think he does that kind of stuff, but I'm assuming here there's some original content going on here. Now I just looked it up. It looks like he's Estonian and was from the Estonian military. So that's an interesting perspective to come at this with. But I thought we would check this out together. The original video is linked down below. Please check that out and sub to his channel. All right, let's get started. All right, let me know any relevant information about Artur here, because again, I've never actually watched the videos. I've just seen them pop up, and I think it usually says like Estonian, like army soldier, reacts and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know what to expect, but it's got a cool background there. Okay, let's see what he's got about Ukraine.
To cover all of Ukraine's history, a video would have to last for several hours. So once again, I'll focus on the most important moments, at least the ones I find significant. The territory of the modern Ukraine.
And you can especially pick out stuff that's going to be relevant for the current conflict. Territorial disputes, cultural differences, cultural similarities, all those types of things.
Ukraine has been inhabited since prehistoric times. Stone tools dating back about 1.4 million years were found in the village of Korolevo in the Zakarpattia region. These are the oldest reliably dated traces of human predecessors' presence in Europe. The lands of modern Western Ukraine have always been rich in black soil, making them fertile ground for settlements once humanity transitioned from foraging to animal husbandry and farming. You know, back in more recent history of the Soviet Union, it was kind of the breadbasket for the Soviet Union, extremely fertile. And that's everything in society, right? Food. Even today, Ukrainian black soils account for about 9% of the world's reserves, 30% of Europe's, and cover an area of approximately 27 million hectares, 46% of the country's territory. Of these, 22 million hectares are arable land suitable for agriculture.
What this also means, and it looks like he's leading to, is it is a place where ancients are going to be drawn to. When you look at ancient history, in the first places that developed agriculture, there's a certain handful of regions around the world that are suitable with ancient technology to be able to do this sort of thing. You know, famously, you got like the ancient river valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and then China, but then there's these other ones as well. So what you're already setting up here with this discussion is that this is going to be an area important to a lot of people that are going to share an ancestry with this region of Ukraine, which is going to be a lot of Eastern Europe.
Ranks fourth globally in the black soil area after Russia, the United States, and China. And yet, Ukrainian black soil is considered the most fertile, having been formed on the highly productive Loess soil. But back to history. Fertile lands and abundant water resources made Ukraine's territory a magnet for settlers throughout history. Hello, my friends. My name is Artur Rehi, and I'm an Estonian reserve soldier and military blogger. And in today's video, the most important chapters in Ukraine's history. My friends, sometimes we joke around in Estonia that it matters more to Estonia who is the president of the United States than who is the president of Estonia. We're talking about that. Trump agrees to pause tariffs on Mexico and Canada after they pledged to
probably need to cover that more, history of tariffs.
This is Ground News, #1 news comparison site of the world, and it's a great tool. There's a difference of agenda on the center, the left, and the right, and you can keep keep an eye on it if you want to. This news is massively covered, and you can see it, 552 news sources. You can see the bias distribution, left 29%,
everyone's covering it,
and right 27%.
When it comes to money, it's everyone.
And you can see the factuality, which is one of the most important tools. We got 68% high factuality, and something I don't see.
The idea of like the ground news thing is
very high factuality. Wow. This is where I want my news. By the way,
they do their own fact checking or what?
You can go to the ownership, find any kind of owner you would like your news source to have. For example, 10% independent news. You'll find those news houses, and the 14% high factuality, you find who has independent ownership and very high factuality. Everything is right in front of your eyes to make sure you don't get garbage. Which news sources fall into that? Why I cover this story now is because it is very much connected to the well-being of my country, Estonia, part of the European Union that Trump has threatened to tariff the hell out of. But if you don't want to follow this news, then you can make up your own homepage here. Click.
Hope you're all ready to be tariffed.
And here you can make up the topics you want to see. For example, I have Ukraine and Ukraine war. I clicked them both, and now I only see these news connected to these two topics and nothing else. By the way, my friends, for a limited time, you can get the same plan I use every day for nearly half the price. Just go to ground.news/Artur or scan the QR code on the screen to get their unlimited access Vantage plan for just $5 a month. Or gift it to someone you know and have more informed conversations. Call out one-sided narratives and think critically about stories shaping this world. I only promote brands I vet, and I think you find Ground News as valuable as I do. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. From the 5th century BCE, the export of grain from the northern Black Sea region to Greece was well documented. By the 4th century AD, during the Great Migration of Peoples, Turkic tribes occupied the steppes of the northern Black Sea region.
Yeah, so the Greeks, by the way, Crimea, this was the first place that in this general conflict, Russia had annexed in 2014. That's this area right here. Very important port trading area. The Greeks were there. And then you see the Turks come in as well. So it's been handed over and controlled by multiple groups. There's just so much, because so much of this stuff comes from nomadic people coming from areas like the Caucasus over to the, to the east, moving down to these more temperate climates, and also some of these, fantastic rivers, something like the Volga River being a big one here for
the Great Migration, a term that sounds like it belongs to a fantasy novel, refers to the mass movements of ethnic groups in Europe between the 4th and 7th centuries, triggered by the Huns invasion from the east in the mid-4th century.
This was, by the way, the final set of dominoes that led to the Western Roman Empire, because those groups, started coming from Asia, the nomadic people coming there, Eastern Europe, get to Central Europe, then start flooding into the Western Roman Empire, which they couldn't maintain anymore. So all of this is the Huns' fault.
By the 7th and 8th centuries, Slavic tribes settled in the Dnipro region. With the advent of agriculture in the 8th century, fortified settlements or hill forts began to spring up, serving as local aristocratic strongholds. Ukraine's geography also made it a crossroads of trade routes between east and west, heavily influencing its eventual centralization as a state. I've touched briefly on Ukraine's history in my video about Russia. Link is on the screen or in the description below, so go and check it out. But let's quickly revisit
Kievan
the
Rus
topic also on this one. Before statehood emerged, the lands of modern Ukraine, Poland and Belarus were settled by Slavic tribes. Slavs are one of the branch of the Indo-European peoples. Their ancestors...
it's a very wide branch, very, very wide branch, shared by so many people in Southeastern Europe, as well as just traditional Eastern Europe, like Russia. Big family tree. Also brings some of the cultural connections that you'll see where, like, as Russia was developing, kind of almost saw itself as like a big brother to protect the little Slavic groups, essentially the Southern Slavic groups around today would be like Serbia, which brings in here some of your alliances that will come to fruition in, like, say, World War I.
Lived in Eastern and Central Europe. Ancient authors like Pliny the Elder and Tacitus first mentioned the Slavs in the 1st to 2nd centuries AD. Slavs were divided into 3 main groups.
Fun fact, Yugoslavia basically means the South Slavs. That'll be created over there.
2nd centuries AD. Slavs were divided into 3 main groups: Eastern, Western, and Southern. The Great Migration was pivotal for the Slavs. From their original territories, between the Oder and Dnipro rivers, they spread across vast areas, expanding their territories and mixing with Finno-Ugric,
and
Baltic,
cool axes.
Thracian, Germanic, Roman, Greek, and Turkic communities. Eastern Slavs settled in modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Western Slavs, the ancestors of Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks, settled between the Elbe and Vistula rivers.
By the way, whole Slavic family tree, this whole thing too, also seen as enemies of the no Germans. You know what I mean? All seen as lower in status.
Southern Slavs migrated to the Balkans and became the ancestors of Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians, who came from the east after the fall of the old Great Bulgaria and mixed with the local tribes. The Slavs were primarily agriculturalists, but also engaged in hunting, fishing, and crafts. Socially, they were organized into communities, and family ties were central. They were pagans, worshipping nature and numerous gods, chief among them being Perun, god of thunder and war. Oh, so cool.
I never heard that term.
And Veles, protector of livestock and wealth.
I've never heard of this.
So cool anymore.
I do not know
and
this mythology.
God of the sun. Before centralized states emerged, Slavic tribes were united in tribal alliances, each led by a chieftain or prince. These tribes often clashed with one another and their neighbors. To better defend their territories and develop trade, they began forming centralized states. Southern and Western Slavs had similar social and tribal organizations to the Eastern Slavs. However, historical conditions and external influences sped up their political consolidation. Southern Slavs fell under the strong influence of the Byzantine Empire, which significantly
kind of sneaks into their whole southern border, I guess, if you will. And then, of course, going to bring the conversion of them to Eastern Christianity. Although the Balkans, kind of interestingly, doesn't unify a lot in a lot of their religious denominations, because you're going to have Islam come eventually with the Ottoman Empire and conversion of a lot of the people, say like in modern day Bosnia. But then you'll have even the Balkan regions, some that stay Catholic. And then, of course, the ones that are going to be Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, or it could be Greek Orthodox or Serbian Orthodox. There's all types of different orthodoxies.
Significantly shaped their political and cultural life. This influence led to their earlier adaptation of Christianity in the 9th century, compared to their Western and Eastern kin. Meanwhile, the foundation of the first state centered in Kiev was taking shape. As a certain famous individual once said, it all began with Rurik in 862.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I wanted to spend some significant time on this if I needed to. Because again, I'm covering this video right now because I'm trying to bring context into the current conflict. And if you remember, Tucker Carlson a few months ago, he went to Russia and he talked with Putin. And basically, what Tucker ended up getting was a history lesson that I'm sure he never knew about. But it was basically like, why did you invade Ukraine? And then literally, like he says in the bubble here, it's like, well, it all started in 862. So like, it is historically motivated, that you're going to see here with Putin. He brings it up as the ancestral home of Russians, the Kievan Rus, which I'm sure he's going to bring in, which complicates things because that's not the only pipeline of ancestry that is shared here, because you're going back 1,500 years in some cases. And the further you get back there, the more there's going to be a branching out of ancestral groups. So to say, you can't say you're like the only pipeline of that group of people, of ancient people, because a lot do that. And then if you're going to claim a territory, you're most likely going to be claiming ancestral territory to people that already are there and also have ancestral claims, which is exactly what is going on right now.
Kievan Rus was formed along the Varangian
very relevant
trade route. a path stretching from the Baltic Sea through Eastern Europe to Byzantium.
You already see the problem here. Can you see it? With Kiev being a such an important part of Russian history, being in Ukraine, right? Like being in Ukraine, but also like Ukrainians, pro-Ukrainians, because you have pro-Ukrainians, you have pro-Russians in Ukraine. It's also their home. You know what I mean? So you have like Moscow, which is going to be the epicenter of their empire, like later on, but their ancestral place is going to be a place that is disconnected from them. You see how this is problematic? And if you're going to use historical claims over 1,000 years old, it goes back to the whole idea about how a tree branch of ancestry, it has a lot of branches. And the further you go back, the more branches there are going to be.
The Varangians, Scandinavian seafarers, and let's not forget their side being as mercenaries, were actively expanding across Europe in the 9th century, raiding and trading their way to
the Norse.
Damn it. I wish I could raid and trade my way to the top. The route passed through major rivers such as the Neva, Lovat, and Dnipro. The journey wasn't exactly
Viking
smooth
long ships
sailing.
are perfect for
the
those
Varangians
rivers.
often had to portage their ships across land. One can only imagine the grueling labor involved, but hey, trade with Byzantium was worth the sweat.
For sure.
Internal conflicts and
those Viking groups also even used those rivers to go and sack Constantinople. They did that before. One of the most interesting little pieces of evidence you can find of that is basically like Viking graffiti in the Hagia Sophia, the Christian church there, where they're like writing out Thor was here or whatever.
External threats pushed Slavic tribes toward unification. It didn't happen overnight. This was a long and complicated process, but by 862, the Slavs struck a deal with the Varangians to establish centralized authority. Like Eric Cartman used to say in South Park, respect my authority.
And you will respect my authority.
Yeah, right.
A Varangian named Rurik ascended to the throne, with Novgorod as the initial center of power. After Rurik's death in 879, Prince Oleg, also known as Oleg the Wise, took over and moved the capital to Kyiv. Oleg acted as a regent for Rurik's young son Igor, or I think Ukrainians would say Ihor. And, as was common in the Middle Ages, he wasn't shy about eliminating his rivals, physically if necessary.
Yeah. That's every group. Every group in power back then, they all did some horrible thing to some other group of people, whether internally and externally. I don't know if we realize how violent things actually were. You see all these empires coming and going. They're not just walking into places. Okay, there are people there and they get slaughtered. It's insanely violent, man. Every group came about by probably genociding somebody else.
Life was tough, short, and not particularly valued back then. Oleg is remembered for his campaign against Byzantium and establishing trade relations. After Oleg's death, the now adult Igor inherited the throne. Rurik's descendants continued to strengthen and expand Kievan Rus. Covering all the events and rulers of Kievan Rus would require an entire series. Hello, Netflix. But I'll try to highlight the most important milestones. Princess Olga, Igor's wife, deserves a special mention. Following Igor's death at the hands of the Drevlians in 945 during a tax collection expedition, Olga became regent for her young son Sviatoslav. She was the first ruler to convert to Christianity in Byzantium and attempted to introduce her son to the faith, though unsuccessfully.
I'm learning a lot, by the way.
Olga is also remembered for her cunning and ruthless revenge against the...
I'm just mostly probably going to, because for a lot of you, this may be brand new history. I am mostly going to try to, I think, insert myself here when I see something that is especially relevant to the context of the conflict right now. So...
Drevlians for her husband's death. Christianization came later, in 988, under the reign of Vladimir the Great, who played a key role in spreading the influence and culture of Kievan Rus. Primary source of information about this period is the Tale of Bygone Years, also called the Primarily Chronicle, written in the 12th century.
What I think is important for you to look at here is so much of this history that we're talking about over in like Kiev, and Novgorod are going to be things that Russians today, again, like Putin talking about, also tie a history with. So this is actually relevant to Russians and literally being talked about as reason for, I guess, taking this area and unifying with this area. So it is relevant. All of it is technically, just because they claim the same ancestry.
Nestor, a monk in the Kiev-Pechersk monastery. The same monastery, by the way, that I delivered all your trucks to when I went to Kiev 8 times in the past 2 years.
You did? Why? Oh. Is he like, he was like a big old squad? I don't know his history. Has he been kind of helping the Ukrainian defense? Is that what his deal has been? Or is he giving aid, like humanitarian efforts? Let me know, you guys that follow him, what's his involvement as an Estonian there? Now, one thing we could say, Estonians in all the Baltic states are going to feel very similar and a lot of sympathy for Ukrainians because they have had recent histories of territorial changes, both from the old Russian Empire and then getting, independence and different types of like borders and things changed with, say, World War I, and then of course going to World War II with the Soviet Union, of these places trying to be reclaimed, have very similar histories and oftentimes an animosity towards Russia.
Very nice. While many scholars criticize some of Nestor's historical accounts, it remains the most comprehensive ancient text about the 9th to 11th centuries. In modern Russia, the tale of bygone years is often viewed as a cornerstone of Russian identity and history, though the history of Kievan Rus is primarily that of Ukraine. Russia, however, attempts to appropriate it. Sure.
Interesting there. So you can see his stance taken there. But again, listen to someone like Vladimir Putin. Again, if you have not heard or seen the interview that he did with Tucker Carlson, he goes to all this and talks about all of this stuff as direct ancestry of Russians. But you can see here, and he's even bringing it up. I mean, he's saying it's more like, it sounds like framing it more as like this is Ukrainian history. And that's true because it's in that territory, but you can see how there's different groups of people sharing a common ancestry. And when you have that, territorial claims based on ancestry is going to be very difficult, especially if you're going to leapfrog recent history to say, no, I'm going to go way back and the earlier history is more important than like the recent history. That becomes extra problematic.
Ukraine's and Russia's histories are intertwined, but the rise of Grand Duchy of Moscow and Russia itself is tied more to the fall of Kiev under Mongol Tatar invasion than to Kiev's formation.
So this is that branch. You see how there's a branch being broken off here. You had one that both went to with the Kievan Rus. Now you've got another one sticking out, and this is Russia.
It's undeniable that the history of Russia's formation is connected to Kievan Rus, and I acknowledged this in my previous video by starting with Kievan Rus. The language, religion, and some traditions share common roots. However, the development of Moscow and Russia is primarily linked to the period of Golden Horde, where state structures, methods of governance, and military strategies were heavily influenced by the Mongols.
Yeah. What the Mongols end up doing is create a tributary state here, where basically this now new Russian empire pretty much had to pay tribute to the Mongols. In my class, I kind of relate it to paying off a bully, where it's like the Mongols come in and say, hey, you guys can do your own thing over here, but you got to pay us money. Otherwise, we're going to, beat you up. And they did that actually for centuries.
Modern Russia has far more in common with the Golden Horde than with Kievan Rus. The golden age of Kievan Rus is traditionally dated to the...
I don't tell that to Putin, though, and probably Russian nationalists. They very much, I would think, would want to reject the Golden Horde era there. So that's where I bet, I don't know. I mean, if you're Russian watching this, what do you think about that?
the 10th to mid-11th. The golden age of Kievan Rus is traditionally dated to the 10th to mid-11th centuries, when Moscow didn't even exist. However, we gotta move on, otherwise this video will end up being several hours long.
The branch is still growing into Moscow.
Brought an end to the Kievan Rus in its original form. The fall of Kiev was due to many factors. After the death of Yaroslav the Wise in 1054, his sons and grandsons,
same year of the Great Schism, Catholic Church and Byzantine Church splitting,
competed for the Kiev throne and influence over key lands. These internal conflicts weakened the unity of the state, and the final blow came with the Mongol invasion, culminating in the fall of Kiev in 1240. After that, parts of the land in southern and western modern Ukraine gradually came under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish crown.
Yeah, you see, so now you're seeing Eastern Europe, now to them, I guess, would be more like Central Europe, are going to creep into those pieces. Now, what ends up happening kind of, I guess, in modern day Russia is a little bit of a mixture of cultures where they were kind of, I don't know, the rest of Europe kind of saw them probably more like cousins, these distant cousins, because they had this mix of Asian culture, I guess, that is coming in as well at this at that time. But what you're going to see, and well, I don't know if I'll get to it or not, because it's going to be more in Russian history, but say like Peter the Great, who's going to come into power once they deshackle themselves from the Mongols, and around, say, about the 1600s, the Russia really tries to, under like Peter the Great, really detach itself from a lot of the I guess Asian influence and leftover Asian influence, and really westernize the country, make it more European than some mutt of Asian and European culture like it was before. And yeah, push it that way. And you can see that influence obviously today.
The northeastern territories fell under the influence of the Golden Horde and Moscow princes. This division led to differing political, cultural, and religious developments in the region, which influenced the formation of modern Ukraine and set it on a unique historical trajectory. The governance style in Moscow differed greatly from the systems in Lithuania and Poland. Moscow adopted a rigid vertical power structure using repression and persecution of opposition, with power passed down through hereditary lines.
Right. It becomes extremely feudal. And interestingly, kind of the last remnants of feudalism in Europe will be here. All this, of course, leading to the Russian Revolution after centuries and centuries of this feudal and very authoritarian, very absolute rule.
I mean, that's not to say democracy and equality flourished across the Dnipro.
No, it's still aristocrats.
But Lithuanian rulers respected the culture and religious traditions of the local population. And after the Union of Craiova in 1385, some of these lands came under Polish control. Catholic cultural influence began to grow. As a result, modern Ukraine's territory became a complex blend of Western European and Eastern Slavic traditions. After the signing of the Union of Lublin and the unification of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in 1569 into one federal state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the influence and power of the Catholic Church only grew. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was literally named after the Latin term respublika, but wasn't a republic in the modern sense. It had a unique political system where power belonged to the nobility, the Szlachta, and the state was headed by a monarch elected for life. The right to elect a monarch was held by the Sejm, a representative assembly of the nobility. The Commonwealth,
saying that's a step up from the Russians, which was just absolute monarchy that was also hierarchical and was a dynasty.
Was relatively progressive. However, we're talking about the Middle Ages. The Polish century, Catholics began to seize lands, displacing the local Orthodox elite. Ukrainians, especially Cossacks and peasants, faced increasing exploitation, religious oppression, and restrictions on rights. The Cossacks, a self-governing military class on the southern outskirts of the Commonwealth, began clashing with the Polish-Lithuanian authorities in the 17th century.
The Cossacks were a pain in the butt for like the authorities of the whole region. The Russians are going to deal with them brutally. But yeah, you see like the Polish dealt with them, because it's one thing to have some wealth and land and stuff, but if you got your own military, Like, that is a problem. You got to be able to rein them in. Now, what ends up happening, you could either slaughter them, which happen in some situations, or you have to give them some kind of power. You have to pay them off, give them privileges like, hey, you get to have, I don't know, no taxes or something like that. It kind of harkens me back to the centralization of power in France. And, you know, the Louis, all those guys, they, to basically get that absolute authority, the nobles, people that own land or could raise militaries, they basically had to get them on their side. One way they would do that is they would get special privileges, not pay taxes and all that. But we also know that that was problematic centuries later, because that is going to be a cause of the problems that are going to lead to the French Revolution. And I guess not surprisingly, there's going to be a revolution over there too in the East.
Over social and religious rights and attempts to limit Cossack autonomy. The most significant of these uprisings was led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648, highlighting the Commonwealth's inability to compromise with the Cossacks. Khmelnytsky gained the support not only of the Cossacks, but also of many representatives of the Ukrainian population
who were
dissatisfied with the Polish rule. The uprising was quite successful. In 1654 to 1655, most of Ukraine, including Kyiv, freed itself from the Polish and Catholic rule, and a new regimental administrative territorial division was introduced, modeled after the Zaporizhian Cossack army. On December 17, 1648, Khmelnytsky triumphantly entered Kyiv through the Golden Gate, welcomed by the ringing of the church bells, cannon fire, and the crowds of thousands of people.
Yay!
However, the war did not end.
It kind of seems like the modern Ukraine. It's not. I mean, it's 1600s here, but the separate Ukrainian identity away from, you know, the group that's going to end up going to Moscow, or the ones that were in North and was it Novgorod, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It seems like this is really their defining moment. And that's something that the Russians, I guess, are not going to be able to share. That identity moment that separates them from now the others.
To restore their power. At the same time, Khmelnytsky, facing a complex diplomatic situation, turned to Muscovy for help, seeking allies in the struggle against the Poles. In 1654, the political entity of the Zaporizhian host, or the Hetmanate, came under the protectorate of Moscow. At first, nothing seemed alarming. According to the agreement, the Hetmanate was granted a significant autonomy. However, soon after, pressure from Moscow increased and Russian princes began tightening their control. Subsequent Ukrainian hetmans altered between signing treaties with the Poles to break free from Moscow's growing influence.
We're going to spelling test at the end of the video, you guys,
the Poles.
On Ukrainian and Russian
the
leaders.
Beginning of one of the most turbulent and tragic periods in the 17th century Ukrainian history, the Ruina, or the ruin. Following Bogdan Khmelnytsky's death, Ukraine plunged into political anarchy, civil wars, foreign interventions, and territorial divisions. Ukraine was now split along the Dnipro River into left bank and right bank territory.
You know, it's interesting that some of this, you know, split on the Dnieper River isn't too far off probably from the pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian sides of Ukraine that exists today, because kind of the eastern third is where you get the most pro-Russian sentiment. Even when you have referendums like they had in Crimea, again, having a much, you can kind of see maybe some of the roots of that, perhaps.
Ultimately, Hetmanate was fully incorporated into Russia under Ivan Prukovetsky. Initially pro-Polish in his political stance, he later sided with Moscow and accepted the humiliating Moscow Articles of 1665. Meanwhile, in the northeast, the so-called Sloboda region emerged. Although not officially part of the Hetmanate, it was under direct administration by Moscow's voivodes and military officials.
Which again today is more pro-Russian side.
Kharkiv, while the Hetmanate capital shifted depending on political circumstances and the ruling hetman. In the 16th to 17th centuries, peasants and Cossacks began migrating en masse to these frontier lands of the Russian Tsardom, escaping feudal and religious oppression in the Commonwealth. These sparsely populated steppe regions were known as Dikoye Pole, or the Wild Fields. The Russian authorities encouraged this resettlement, granting privileges to newly established settlements.
Some of these details are stuff I am learning for the first time. And of course, as you all should, you should be taking all history with a grain of salt, because history can be framed in certain ways and whatever. I'm not saying he's necessarily doing that, but it happens. So if you have anything to add, certain contextual interpretations or events or something, feel free to respectfully add those in the comments so I can see some of that, and that other viewers can see that too. Make a healthy discussion out of it.
Exempting them from taxes and certain obligations for a time in exchange for military service and frontier defense. The term sloboda derives from the type of settlements that enjoyed greater freedoms than those deeper within the state. Sloboda being rooted in the word svoboda, or freedom. But spoiler alert, those freedoms didn't last long. Moscow soon began a campaign of Russification in these new territories, especially intensifying in the 18th to 19th centuries.
You can see it had an effect,
for
sure.
Those Russian traditions. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, publishing Ukrainian language books was allowed, although their content was sometimes censored. But in Moscow-controlled territories, the Russian Orthodox Church banned church books printed in Old Ukrainian as early as the late 17th century. In 1720, Peter the Great issued a decree banning the printing of Ukrainian language book in Kiev-Pechersk.
Peter's going to have a huge impact on the future Russia. I mentioned him earlier in the video, if you remember, about where Russia will very intentionally, at least from their the seat of the monarchy, really try to westernize this culture, make it look and feel more like Western Europe. Peter was one that had grown up and traveled throughout Western Europe and admired a lot of the culture and the technology and a lot of that stuff, and wanted to bring that back. One of those famous things, if you maybe had forgotten, that was kind of funny about trying to make Russia a little more culturally like Western Europe, was the whole beard tax, basically trying to force the nobles to shave their beards, which again was a common feature in Western Europe. But little things like that of trying to westernize their culture, but he was really doing this hard.
And Chernihiv printing houses. This was his response to Hetman Ivan Mazepa siding with the Swedes during the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721.
Peter was trying to gain warm water port access. One thing Russia did not have at this time was a year-round warm water port. And one of the things he wanted, because like every great Western European state had, was vibrant ports with ships and navies and all that stuff. Russia didn't have that kind of access. The Ottoman Empire controlled around the Black Sea, so getting that territory was not theirs. And they had mild success against the Swedes, but only for the fact that they could get what's going to be St. Petersburg up in kind of the northern Baltic region, which was kind of his plan B. He would have, loved to get more southern territories around the Black Sea, but couldn't get it. But St. Petersburg was kind of, I guess, a consolation prize, although it's actually not very well suited to be a port. It took an incredible amount of labor, essentially slave labor, to make that a viable port by having to dig out, because it was swampy. But even then, it was problematic because it does freeze at times. And that's why one of his successors later on, Catherine, which I'm sure we'll get to, is going to expand Russia even more, both south and west. And with the combination of both of them, eventually you're going to get control all the way to the east by Vladivostok towards the Pacific Ocean. But that's other stuff's going to come with Catherine, who's going to push them even more, make even more Western. And it made sense, too, because, well, maybe he'll get to it, but Catherine was essentially German. She was Prussian and was a Western European.
In an attempt to defeat Russia and break free from its control, in November 1708, Russian troops stormed the Hetman capital of Baturin, burned it down, and brutally massacred its population. Ugh. A casual Tuesday in the life of a Russian colony. The Swedes were defeated at Poltava in 1709, forcing Mazepa to flee to Turkey. Peter I sanctioned an attack on the Zaporizhian Zich, which had supported Mazepa. The fortifications were destroyed, and some Zaporizhians fled to territories under the control of the Crimean Khanate or Ottomans. Russification efforts intensified. In 1764, Catherine II issued instructions for the Russification of Ukraine, Smolensk, the Baltic states, and Finland.
It is interesting because, again, her background as a Prussian princess, essentially, but she actually went to extensive efforts to become Russified herself. She learned Russian very quickly and used it, wanted to be ingrained sort of in the culture, and then expand their territories, which she's going to do extensively down to the Black Sea, and is going to annex half of Poland.
Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church ordered the confiscation of Ukrainian primers and church books, and 2 years later, the Ukrainian language was banned in church services and teaching at the Kiev Mohila Academy. The same year, Catherine II abolished the Hetmanate and established the Malorossiya, or Little Russia, government. Here is her quote on the matter, and I quote, "Little Russia, Livonia, and Finland are provinces governed by confirmed privileges. To revoke them all at once would be highly inappropriate. These provinces, as well as Smolensk, must be gradually brought to a state where they will be Russified and stop looking like wolves in the forest."
That's how she thought of those people. And again, it comes from the line of Peter that it's like, we are modernizing, we are westernizing, we're going to clean up our act, and you have got to get on board. And, you know, from Peter through her was dragging everyone into compliance, basically drag them kicking and screaming to make these cultural changes and to adopt them.
Now here is a Russian Tsar calling my forefathers wolves in the forest. That's a fine compliment I'm willing to take. The lands in the lower reaches of the Dnipro, the Azov region, and the Crimea were still under control of the Crimean
warm water port territory,
which had emerged after the collapse of the Golden Horde. Crimean Tatars and Ottomans regularly raided Russian territories. For anyone still convinced that Crimea is inherently Russian, though I doubt anyone in my audience thinks that, ask the Crimean Tatars.
Yeah, it's more Tatars rather than Ukrainian or Russian in that fact. Although both, you know, all have occupied that areas. Because Tatars, they're neither Ukrainian they're more Turkish than anything.
These territories came under Russian control in 1774. How cool is that in 2 years the Constitution of the United States of America was formed? Nice. Through a peace treaty between the Russian and Ottoman empires after the series of Russo-Turkish wars. Initially, the Tatars in Crimea retained autonomy and the lands were settled by Eastern Slavs. Serbs relocated from the Balkans, as well as Greeks, Germans, and Jews. Russia formally annexed Crimea in 1783.
I should note with the Jewish populations, for wondering why Jewish populations are there. A lot of going back to the Middle Ages, you know, as many of you probably know, with like the plague, was very harsh because of the scapegoating against Jews for that reason. And there was a migration of a lot of Jews in Europe to move towards, especially like Poland, where they were seen and treated better, which kind of made them a magnet into moving the Jewish population into the East. But we also know that with the growth of these groups, you're going to get the pogroms and all the other awful things that happen to the Jewish population here in Eastern Europe.
This was far from the last conflict with the Ottomans. Disputes over control of Crimea continued into the future,
warm water ports,
most notably during the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Russia's attack on the Ottoman Empire led to conflict with the coalition that included the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, France, and the Kingdom of Sardinia.
This was the growth of Russia that was seen as threatening to the balance of power. If you're wondering why like France and Britain was part of this, was that it was upsetting the balance of power. That's what they were kind of feared. That was a big theme kind of around this time. You'll see in Europe, you have these big states that were all supposed to, again, kind of balance each other out. Actually, they get bigger after Napoleon, but that was to create more of a balance of power. That's why like France, United Kingdom are going to join in. Otherwise, you might be like, what the heck are they doing, fighting over in Crimea?
Western powers sought to prevent Russia's expansion into the Balkans and its access to the Mediterranean Sea.
Right.
Most of the fighting took place in Crimea, where British and French expeditionary forces landed near Eupatoria and besieged Russia's primary Black Sea port, Sevastopol. The city's fierce defense, lasting nearly a year, cost both sides heavy losses.
By the way, some people kind of call the Crimean War one of the first modern wars that was using a lot more of like the modern tactics and some of the newer technology that is coming out now. Kind of right of like a pre-modern maybe, but you know, getting up to that. You know, a lot of people like to say it was more, not even Franco-Prussian, but like not Franco-Prussian, but like World War I. But you're kind of getting into that thing with really new technologies making a big thing. For example, like everybody having gunpowder now. So everybody has like cannons and all that big stuff to make you blow up. And why you're going to see casualty rates that were just insane as compared to wars before this. This is getting into that modern warfare area.
The Allies' military and material support enabled the Ottoman Empire to resist the Russian army and seize the initiative.
And this was embarrassing
the
for the
Treaty of
Russians.
Paris limited Russia's influence in the Black Sea, declaring it neutral waters. Meanwhile, during the late 18th century, the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth began, with Austria's Habsburgs acquiring Galicia and nearby areas, forming the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria with Austrian administration.
No one likes the Habsburgs.
Ukrainian lands of the right bank fell under the Russian Empire, which gradually imposed its own systems and bureaucracy. As a result, the former Commonwealth territories predominantly inhabited by Ukrainians were divided between two powers. Austria, which sought to preserve local identities within the limited framework of its multi-ethnic monarchy, and Russia, which pursued an aggressive Russification policy.
This is where the Poland that everybody kind of will pity from this moment on, being torn apart by Central Europe, between Central Europe and Russia, of being invaded from different times and being split apart and losing kind of their Polish identity. Well, I mean, they always keep it, but having this pressure on them to like Russify or become more like Germanic.
In the 19th century, Russia abolished the so-called Magdeburg rights,
the 1800s
a
now.
legal system regulating urban life, property rights, and economic activity that had existed since the 13th century. Ukrainian Sunday schools were closed, and the publication of Ukrainian language literary and scholarly journals such as Osnova were halted. In 1863, a decree issued by the Minister of Internal Affairs, Pyotr Valuyev, banned the publication of religious, educational, and elementary reading materials in Ukrainian, which Russia referred to as Malorossy, Little Russian. Importing Ukrainian language books from abroad was
Little Russian. It seems kind of derogatory almost, huh?
Prohibited, as was printing Ukrainian texts under musical notes and staging Ukrainian plays. Notably, Mykola Lysenko, the father of Ukrainian national music, had to perform the Ukrainian folk song The Rain in French to bypass these restrictions. Ukrainian dictionaries...
They're like, hey, we would rather be French than Russian. That's what they're saying. You start to see a little bit of the animosity now by Ukrainians from what they've experienced.
Could be published, but only if written using Russian orthography. Alexander III issued a decree banning the use of Ukrainian in official institutions and prohibiting Ukrainian names during baptisms. At an archaeological congress in Kyiv, scholars were permitted to present papers in any language except Ukrainian. In effect, the Ukrainian language was outlawed. However, starting in the late 18th century, a Ukrainian national movement began to emerge. First culturally, and by the 1840s, politically. The formation of a modern Ukrainian nation began. Taras Shevchenko's works were crucial in awakening national consciousness. Due to repression by the Tsarist authorities, the movement's center shifted to Galicia in the 1870s. By the late 19th century, Ukrainian political parties emerged, some of which advocated for an independent Ukrainian state. In the Russian-controlled territories, repression of Ukrainians persisted. At the unveiling of a monument to Ivan Ivan Kotlяревsky in Poltava in 1903, Ukrainian speeches were prohibited. In 1908, a Senate decree declared educational activities in Ukraine harmful and dangerous to Russia. In 1910, the Prime Minister Stolypin classified Ukrainians as aliens and banned all Ukrainian organizations. In 19...
So I guess, you know, if any of you right now are maybe typing responses to this that, I don't know, what lightens the amount of influence that Russia had, if you're finding yourself trying to be like, this is, I don't want to say propaganda, but if it's just being framed intentionally in a certain way, then provide something substantial that we can compare it with. Because obviously what's being, you know, framed here, being shown is how much of Ukrainian culture is now being erased, I guess, or intentionally erased by Russia, seeing Ukrainians as a threat here too. So I don't know, you have to think of some good arguments for that, or if you're trying to counter the tone that's happening here.
13, the trustee and banned all Ukrainian organizations. In 1913, the trustee of the Kyiv Educational District prohibited students from attending Ukrainian theater performances. In 1914, commemorating Taras Shevchenko's 100th birthday was banned, and Tsar Nicholas II issued a decree prohibiting Ukrainian language press. Russia sought to erase Ukrainian identity and rewrite history to suit its narrative. The current war in Ukraine is nothing but another attempt to destroy Ukraine's independent identity and falsely claim its territories as historically Russian.
What's going to be, and that is, I mean,
identity and falsely claim its territories as historically Russian.
So that's where it's being complicated. The territories of what I'm talking about now was the more that's been taken over by Russia is the more pro-Russian part, right? Even if it came to, you know, votes and referendums and stuff like that to like leave Ukraine, those kind of things are going to have more strength there. But the interesting part about like Kiev, which again, you go back to what Putin was saying about as a major part of Russian ancestry, is in a territory that's far more Ukrainian. So it's like, what are the territorial desires here? Is it just to take the parts that again are more pro-Russian? Or is it the entire Ukrainian state? Is it to just get Kiev eventually, then call it good there? Those are things I don't know if they're going to come out in these negotiations because Russia does not control Kiev. But again, if you're using this historical argument, like I've repeated multiple times about Kiev being an integral part of Russian ancestry, where will those claims be decided? And we'll see in the coming weeks as talks seem to be being really forced upon the sides right now because Ukraine not doing well. We have an administrative change that seems to in the United States here that is changing what the American influence foreign policy is going to be here in Ukraine, that it's going to fast forward these talks there. But what is going to be the end goal for, say, Russia? What will they accept? And will they accept not, again, getting Kiev, which seems to be something important with the cultural arguments that Vladimir Putin is making? What do you guys think?
Another opportunity to restore an independent Ukrainian state arose during the World War I and the subsequent revolution in Russia. The collapse of the Russian Empire allowed many occupied nations to begin their struggle for independence, including Estonia, which I'll definitely cover in a future video. In early 1918, the Central Rada, the all-Ukrainian council that united deputies of soldiers, workers, and peasants' deputies, as well as few members of political, public, agricultural, and professional organizations, proclaimed the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, severing ties with the former Russian Empire and attempting to establish a sovereign state. However, advancing Bolshevik forces forced the Republic to seek support from the Central Powers, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the deployment of German and Austro-Hungarian forces into Ukrainian territory.
So Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is the treaty that Russia signed with Germany as they were getting their butts kicked in World War I. It gets signed pretty quickly after the Bolsheviks take power, as part of their platform was to end this war that, again, was disastrous at this time for Russia. It also included them giving up a ton of territory, including the Baltic states, but that whole region. Pull up a map of what the treaty line is going to be. Now, that's not going to last very long because, within 2 years, you're going to get the Treaty of Versailles, but then also because Germany's going to lose and not be able to keep all this territory they signed with Russia, which is going to piss them off. And also pissed off the Russians too, because what ends up happening is that stuff, those territories were not given back to the newly, almost created here. There's still the Russian Civil War going on. That'll end in 22 is not going to go back to Russia, but instead self-determination, meaning a bunch of states in Eastern Europe are going to get their independence. So that's going to piss off Germany. That's going to piss off the new Soviet Union. And they are going to still be under threat to keep their autonomy. And you're going to see what's going to happen in World War II, which the Soviet Union, is going to take those territories in their war with Germany in World War II and bring it under the sphere of the Soviet Union.
In April 1918, with German military support, Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky declared the establishment of the Ukrainian state. The fall of the German Empire in late 1918 left Skoropadsky without support, and in December his regime was overthrown by the Directory of the Ukrainian People's Republic led by Simon Petliura and Vladimir Vinichenko. The Directory attempted to restore the republic and resumed the fight against the Bolsheviks for independence. Despite severe political instability and constant military pressure, this period marked the first time in modern history that Ukraine achieved the status of an independent state. Amid the chaos of the civil war and a lack of strong international support, the Ukrainian forces were unable to maintain control over most of the territory.
Ukraine's going to have an interesting position in the Civil War because, with the Russian Civil War basically being the Bolsheviks versus everybody else, they call them the White Army, but they were a broad range of political persuasions, I guess. Pretty much anyone that's not going to be a Bolshevik, but Ukraine had support on both sides of that. But again, foreign influence comes in there as well. So with that too, with how many people were against, the Bolsheviks there in Ukraine, when the Soviet Union does take over, they're going to see Ukraine as a place that was an enemy. It was an enemy of the Civil War. Therefore, it's going to be a potential enemy or a potential threat once the war ends and the Soviet Union is in full control. Because again, there was so much anti-Bolshevist sentiment there as well.
Early 1919, Bolshevik forces had retaken Kyiv. Simultaneously, in the west, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed. But it too failed to resist the Bolshevik pressure. By the end of 1920, most Ukrainian lands had fallen under the control of the Red Army, and the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic was declared on the territory, later becoming a part of the Soviet Union in 1922. The 20th century was one of the darkest chapters in Ukrainian history. Repression of Ukrainians, along with other peoples under Soviet rule, intensified exponentially. Stalin's policies led to one of the greatest tragedies in Ukrainian history, the Holodomor. The famine resulted from forced collectivization of agriculture and imposition of impossible grain procurement quotas.
So yeah, like we were saying, Ukraine is going to be a breadbasket for, the Soviet Union there. So removing and taking control early, because it's collectivization going to be happening here, which means, private land ownership is not pretty much going to exist, which means all the output is going to be controlled by the state. And also an area that was also distrusted, they have their hand on the throat of Ukraine. They can, pinch a little bit and kill Ukraine off if they potentially get out of, hand. And again, because of what you saw in the Civil War, trust level isn't great, but then also because of collectivization was also a very hard thing to transition to. It meant that a lot of food in Ukraine is going to be exported to other parts of the Soviet Union. And I know a lot of people will debate about the intentionality of starving out the people of Ukraine. I've heard people say a lot of different things, and you can make your case, I guess, if you want to. But regardless, millions died in Ukraine, which is going to obviously give them a very anti-Russian future, you know, or at least mentality going into the future.
Farmers were
you don't forget this
stripped
kind
of
of
their
starvation,
grain and
millions.
means of subsistence. Not only surpluses were seized, but also the seed stocks.
Right.
Villages that failed to meet the quotas were blacklisted, effectively blocking them from receiving or sending out food. Resistance to these measures was brutally suppressed by the Soviet authorities. As a result, millions of people died of starvation, though the exact number of victims remains a subject of scholarly debate.
Someone said 6
Estimates range from approximately 3 to 7 million. In recent decades, many countries have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide of the Ukrainian people, emphasizing
That's
its
probably where the debate really comes. Obviously, it's not a debate that people starve, but like the intentionality, because the idea of genocide usually is attached to intentionality to it. Was this an intentional thing to suppress Ukraine for being potential subversives?
deliberate and artificial genocide of the Ukrainian people, emphasizing its deliberate and artificial nature. The very word Holodomor derived from holod, hunger, and marit, to
hunger.
starve, reflects the scale of the catastrophe and its place in the Ukrainian collective memory.
what is this
World War
artwork?
II
That was
brought the
crazy.
next wave of tragedy, devastating Ukrainian lands and causing millions of civilian deaths. Most of the fighting between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht took place in modern Ukraine, which was occupied by the Nazis from 1941.
Now, there were a lot of collaborators. As you can tell, there's going to be a lot of sentiment to basically get help from anybody that isn't the Soviet Union. And, you know, I know a lot of people will say, well, like, oh, well, Ukrainians, they were like siding with the no Germans. But like, look at the context of what was going on. It's like almost anything that the no Germans are going to bring in here. I use that name because you can get censored. This video will probably get demonetized, but thanks to all of you, by the way, that support with channel memberships. That really helps me out with so much of this content being demonetized. But you can see why so many people might collaborate with the Germans in World War II, which is going to also make them look very bad once the war is over and the Soviet Union takes over again, and just fuel that again. But you can see the context of why people would ally.
To 1944. Approximately 5 by the Nazis from 1941 to 1944. Approximately 5 million Ukrainian civilians perished, and over 7 million people from the Ukrainian SSR were conscripted into the Red Army.
Have you heard of one of the motivations, especially you really heard this at the beginning of the invasion into Ukraine, here recently, was like the denazification of Ukraine. You might have heard that a lot. But you can see where that framing comes about of the history, that because Ukraine becomes, much of it so anti-Russian because of their experience, that any kind of opposition to them might come off as looking like ultranationalists, which is going to become synonymous with, Nazism. And even in the modern sense, people use that. But you can see the context of where that comes from.
0.5 to 3 million of them never returned from the front lines. At the start of the German offensive, Stepan Bandera and his supporters from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists
Bandera is an interesting last name
attempted
for
to declare
Ukrainian.
Ukrainian independence on June 30th, 1941. However, the Nazis did not recognize this declaration and soon arrested Bandera, detaining him in a concentration camp until 1944. After World War II, Soviet occupation of Ukraine continued. Many were sent to the Gulag system. Between the 1920s and
Prison labor
1950s,
camps.
estimates suggest that 1 to 3 million Ukrainians were deported to labor camps, with most never returning. Russification and repression persisted even after Stalin's death. In 1961, the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union adopted a program promoting the merger of nations into single Soviet people.
Interesting there, because Khrushchev, isn't he Ukrainian as well? But obviously on the very pro-Russian side.
All official documentation and education were conducted in Russian. By 1979, the Russian language was officially proclaimed as the language of friendship among nations. But the Soviet Union began to collapse just a decade later, giving many countries the chance to regain their independence. On August 24th, 1991, the Verkhovna Rada of the Ukrainian SSR proclaimed the independence of Ukraine, establishing the independent Ukrainian state of Ukraine. This was later confirmed by a nationwide referendum on December the 1st, 1991. Today, as Russia lays claim to the Donetsk and Luhansk region, it conveniently ignores the result of that referendum. Even in those regions, the majority voted for independence.
You can see, you notice how the more easterly it gets, the more the reluctance. You can see the thing, they're reluctant to have that referendum. But interestingly, this is going to increase over time because you had the referendum in 2014. From what I understand, even by third-party Western analysis, the referendum that went down in Crimea, which was very pro-Russian, was legitimate. And you're going to see higher numbers probably. So this is a 91. Referendums that would happen now in some of those eastern regions I think would be higher than 50 and 60%, like you're seeing in the brightest of the green regions too. So these sentiments here by a lot of the people living here have changed since 1991, at least in the eastern regions, like the eastern third, as you can tell there, with Crimea probably being the most pro-Russian, I think.
The history of modern Ukraine also deserves its own dedicated video, as the country's political situation, Kremlin's attempts to even exert influence, and the role of Western allies all culminated in the events of 2014, including the annexation of Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, followed by Russia's full-scale invasion. This war has nothing to do with NATO expansion or denazification of Ukraine. It is yet another attempt.
Yeah, that's the current context that's being discussed, because you do have to bring in NATO and the expansion of NATO that has occurred going from the 90s. Is it in like, what year was it? I got to look at it again. Was it the late 90s where like the Baltic states all joined? Because it was kind of, it seemed like an understanding here in the earlier years of NATO that NATO would not include the border regions. The states that border, Russia or the Soviet Union directly. And then even after the Soviet Union collapses in 91, that would still kind of be like the understanding. Russia was also, I think, kind of was upset, and I think still is, that NATO even exists after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which has been talked about. But again, I do think it's impossible to just take those modern contexts of denazification or whatever and NATO expansion into what's going on, because Putin has routinely talked about the ancestral claims that he believes are essential towards Russian culture and Russian identity. And that's got to be important, because that becomes the thing where it becomes very hard to argue, and on their side, trying to claim that whole history as pretty much Russian.
By Russia to erase Ukraine's national identity and Russify its territories, as it has tried to do throughout history. Russia considers itself the heir to Kievan Rus and seeks control over the historical center. It is an attempt to rewrite history and claim what does not belong to it. Russia's methods, rooted in the practices of the Golden Horde, have only grown more brutal and sophisticated with the advancements of technology and weaponry. Ukrainians are not Russia's brotherly people. They have always been victim to the Russian aggression and policies of Russification. The Russified territories now serve as a pretext for Russian aggression under the guise of protecting the Russian-speaking population. A narrative that
was a big one that was talked about with both Crimeans and the Eastern Russia. Now, he hasn't brought up some of the other claims that doesn't make Ukraine look good, especially with some of their presidential elections and some of the drama that has gone on with them. Because what often happens here in Ukrainian presidential elections is you have your Ukrainian more pro-Ukrainian, pro-West, I guess you would say, candidate. But then you have your more pro-Russian candidate, and it can kind of bounce back and forth. And in recent history, there was definitely some drama and some controversy about some of the results, and basically coups to take out certain elected ones. And I know that happened with a more pro-Russian elector. And that was seemingly kind of the final straw for the Russians, saying that even through diplomatic processes, the more pro-Russian people are not, they're being cheated out, I guess you would say, which is to justify, I guess, the liberation of those people. But again, cannot ignore the cultural claims being made here.
Persisted for centuries. Today, Ukraine is once again forced to fight for its existence, and we can only wish for its swift victory and offer our support in every way possible. Thank you, my friends, for watching this video.
So that's why
if you like this new kind of format, you can always support the channel through Buy Me a Coffee, and I'll be sending you one of these patches as a thank you. Everyone who is a monthly member will get this patch.
That's
Link
cool.
is in the description below. Until my next video, my friends, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.
All right, very detailed video, especially when he got up to, say, what, the Crimean War, I guess. He was bringing in a lot of stuff. The last about 200 years of history, he did go 150 to 200. He went, pretty quick through to bring that up, and I understand that. But so the most stuff I had learned was the stuff from very early on, which is good. But hopefully, I was able to highlight again the Russian claims to a lot of that answer, that history. So this all brings me back to why I chose to cover this video right now, and why you're probably watching it, was to hopefully learn context of the current conflict. And right now, as it seems that the different sides are really being forced to the table here, and you could say what you want about, the current Trump administration and how they are assuming this what role they're assuming in these negotiations. That's of course one thing. But what's going to be interesting is, I guess, now to see what the end of this is going to look like. Is it going to be, most certainly is going to be territory claimed, kind of like what happened with Ukraine, of at least probably the eastern third of Russia. I got to look at that. I can't imagine, with, again, kind of the support right now to end this war as quickly as possible, that Russia will have to give up a lot of the territory they have taken from Ukraine. I can't imagine, I wouldn't think it would go to the extreme of like all of Ukraine gets annexed. I don't think that would happen. But that also, though, is ignoring what's going to happen now that it seems the United States is not going to give anything now to Ukraine. A lot of supplies and support has been given in these first 3 years of the war, with the United States now seemingly now going to end pretty much all support for it. Does that now mean Europe will pick up the slack? How much with Europe? Because the Western, everyone else in Europe has been very pro-Ukraine, it seems, and at least has said that they will start to support, if the United States backs out, they will support potentially more. Will that be enough to, say, push the Russians back from all the things that they've acquired thus far in this war? I don't know about that. But it depends on how much support comes in. If this becomes a Russia versus like most of the rest of Europe, then it's going to be a very interesting thing of whatever comes out of this. There's a lot that can happen here between now and then, but I think it is really important to talk about some of this context, because here's something I can tell you guys pretty confidently just by watching this and watch the other videos that I've tried to bring to your attention, because there's some really good ones with Ukraine. Just by watching some of those, you're ahead of most people when it comes to the real history of this conflict and the real context to this. And dare I say, even amongst many people that are influential in the policy determining this, is how ignorant a lot of people are going to be to this. How many people do you think are involved in this now from different countries, whether it's the United States or wherever, that is like never heard of the Kievan Rus? Or shoot, even the Holodomor, you know what I mean? Which are very real things in the sentiment of the Ukrainian people, that some people might be like, who cares? It doesn't matter. But it matters. It matters to the people involved in this. So understanding that context, even minimally with these videos, I think puts you ahead of most people, I feel like. So Anyway, keep looking at other things. Obviously, this video is very much framed in such of really supporting, I think, the Ukrainian history here with Russia. I know assuredly a bunch of you are going to maybe, I don't know if you're going to bring in more Prussian or Russian sentiment or maybe more perspective of that. Keep it to that. I know some of you probably, because a lot of your Americans are going to talk about America's role, which really has nothing to do with any of this. It has something to do with the end of the war, but not into some of the causes here and what's really at stake. So anyway, do what you will with that. And again, thanks for watching, and we'll see y'all next time.